the year 1377 since the Nativity of Christ. In the heart of the Lithuanian forests, in an impassable thicket where the roots of ancient oaks and sacred ash trees intertwined, a sacred fire was dying out. Its flames cast bizarre dancing shadows on the stern faces of warriors in wolfskins and on the wrinkled face like the bark of a tree. Of the high priest, the Krevitis Lizdika, the air hung thick with the smell of smoke, damp leaves, melted wax, and sacrificial blood. Here, far from stone castles and Christian churches in the last pagan stronghold of Europe, the Grand Duke Algirdas was fading in the sacred grove. He lay on a bed of bear skins, this great warrior, son of Gediminas, who for 45 years had expanded the borders of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania with fire and sword. A man who had crushed 3 Tatar hordes in the great Battle of Blue Waters, forever freeing Podolia and Kiev from their rule. A man who had thrice approached the walls of Moscow itself, forcing its proud Prince Dmitri to lock himself in the Kremlin. His breath was weak, but his eyes, faded by time and battles, still burned with a sharp, piercing intellect. Around him, holding their breath, stood his sons, born of 2 wives, one Orthodox and one pagan, a whole litter of wolf cubs, each already sensing the intoxicating scent of power. No one spoke a word, but the air was electrified with tension. Everyone waited to see to whom the old duke would pass supreme power, to whom he would leave his greatest treasure, the Grand Ducal throne in Vilnius. His elder sons, mighty warriors who ruled in Russian cities, stood clutching the hilts of their swords. Andrei of Polotsk, the eldest, battle-hardened, the terror of the Pskov and Novgorod lands. Skirgaila, boisterous and fierce, whose rage in battle had become legendary. Each considered himself worthy. Each saw in his brothers a mortal rival. But Algirdas's gaze slid past them and settled on a youth standing slightly aside, in the shadows. He possessed neither the gigantic stature nor the fearsome appearance of his brothers. He was thin, tall, with the long, slender fingers of an aristocrat and pensive, slightly slanted eyes, in which lurked not a warrior's fury but a cold, waiting cunning. His name was Jogaila. It was to him, to his favorite son by his second Orthodox wife, Princess Uliana of Tver, that the dying Algirdas pointed with a bony finger. At that moment, not only the last word of the Grand Duke was spoken in the sacred grove. At that moment, a mine was laid under the unity of the vast pagan empire. No one yet knew that this quiet, unassuming youth would become the last pagan ruler of Lithuania, that he would accept baptism and wear the crown of a neighboring kingdom, that his name, given at birth in honor of pagan gods, would be changed to a Christian one, and he would enter history as Władysław II Jagiełło, King of Poland. No one could have foreseen that he would have to go through betrayals, fratricidal wars, alliances with sworn enemies, and the greatest battle of the Middle Ages to found a dynasty that would rule Central and Eastern Europe for 2 centuries. This is the story of a man who stood at the crossroads of epochs, faiths, and civilizations. The story of Jogaila, the last pagan and the first king of a new era. Before Prince Jogaila found himself at the center of major European politics, he was the ruler of a world that to the rest of Europe seemed a mysterious and frightening relic of the Dark Ages. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Ruthenia, and Samogitia at the end of the 14th century was the last bastion of paganism on the continent. It was a huge, loose empire stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea steppes, a land of sacred groves where the thunder god Perkunas, the mother goddess Lima, and a whole pantheon of forest and household spirits were worshipped. A land of fearless warriors and cunning diplomats which waged a desperate struggle for survival squeezed between 2 worlds, the world of the Catholic cross and the world of the Orthodox cross. It was in this world, steeped in ancient beliefs and the smell of eternal war, that the character and will of the future king were forged. Lithuanian paganism was not the primitive idolatry that Christian chroniclers portrayed it to be. It was a complex system of beliefs deeply woven into nature itself. For the Lithuanians, there were no man-made temples. Their temples were ancient oak groves, their altars moss-covered boulders. In Vilnius, in the Šventaragis valley, a sacred fire burned, which the priests, or vaidylos, maintained, never letting it die out day or night, for it was believed that with its extinguishing, the very life of the people would be cut short. They saw a living soul in every tree, in every river, in every animal. They worshipped Perkunas, the lord of thunder and sky, whose symbol was the axe. They revered Jemapatis, the god of the earth and harvest, and Laima, the goddess of fate, who at the birth of every person wove the thread of their life into the common tapestry of the world. It was a world where the boundary between the world of humans and the world of spirits was thin and permeable. This faith, this inseparable connection with their native land, gave the Lithuanians the desperate courage and persistence that allowed them for 200 years to single-handedly resist the onslaught of all of Catholic knighthood. Lithuanian society was not just a society of warriors. Its wealth, beside military booty, was based on the gifts of the boundless forest. Honey and wax, which were valued in Europe more than gold as they were necessary for church candles. Furs including sable, marten, and squirrel, and also amber, the Lithuanian gold. All this flowed down the rivers to the markets of the Hanseatic League and Rusian cities. The common people, the free farmers known as laukininkai, lived in small settlements scattered throughout the forests, practicing slash-and-burn agriculture. Above them stood the emerging military aristocracy, the bajorai, whose life was subordinated to one thing: war. To understand Jogaila, one must understand the world into which he was born. He was born around 1362, although the exact date of his birth remains a matter of debate. His father was Grand Duke Algirdas, and his mother was Uliana, daughter of Prince Alexander Mikhailovich of Tver. This marriage itself was a symbol of the dual nature of the Grand Duchy. Algirdas, though tolerant of orthodoxy, remained a pagan until the end of his life, as did his brother Kęstutis. They were the last European monarchs who offered sacrifices to the old gods. His wife, Uliana, was a devout Orthodox Christian. Their children, including Jogaila, were raised at the intersection of two cultures. From childhood, they heard both pagan hymns and Orthodox prayers. They saw both priests performing rites in sacred groves and priests serving liturgy in the stone churches of Russian cities. This internal duality, this ability for mimicry and adaptation, would become one of Jogaila's main character traits. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania itself, or the Jagiellonian, was a unique state entity. Its core was the ethnic Lithuanian and Samogitian lands, Aukštaityje and Žemaitija, where paganism was preserved. But 9/10 of the territory of this vast state was made up of former lands of Kievan Rus, conquered or annexed by Jogaila's grandfather and father, Gediminas and Algirdas. On these lands lived Eastern Slavs who professed orthodoxy and spoke the West Ruthenian language, which was the official language of the duchy's chancery. Lithuanian princes ruled Russian cities: Polotsk, Vitebsk, Kiev, Chernigov. They adhered to the wise principle of not destroying the old, not introducing the new. They preserved local laws, customs, and most importantly, the faith. It was an empire built on the military strength of the Lithuanian knighthood and the cultural foundation of conquered Rus. A Lithuanian prince in Vilnius ruled Kiev and Smolensk, while the Catholic world considered him a wild idolater. But this world was in constant danger. From two sides, two powerful civilizations were advancing on it, each considering it its duty to convert the last pagans of Europe to its faith. From the east and south, it was the Orthodox civilization. Its main center was rapidly becoming Moscow, which under the rule of Dmitry Donskoy began to gather the Russian lands and just 3 years after Algirdas's death, would openly challenge the Golden Horde on the Kulikovo field. The Moscow princes saw the Lithuanian rulers as their main rivals for the Russian heritage. They sought to win over the Orthodox princes and boyars of the GDL, playing on their religious feelings. Algirdas waged 3 major wars with Moscow, but was never able to break its growing power. From the west and north, the threat was even more terrible. It was the Catholic world, and its striking fist was the Teutonic order. This military monastic state, created to fight pagans, held the lands of Prussia and Livonia and effectively cut Lithuania off from the Baltic Sea. For the Teutonic Knights, war with Lithuania was not just politics, it was their destiny, their sacred duty. Every year in winter, when the rivers and swamps froze, they organized so-called Ryzen, devastating campaigns deep into Lithuanian lands. They burned villages, drove away cattle, and killed and captured thousands of people. For them, it was an act of piety, a crusade to which knights from all over Europe, from England to Hungary, flocked to earn remission of sins by fighting the Saracens of the north. For the Lithuanians, it was a total war of survival. It was not just a military conflict, but a permanent existential terror. Every generation was born and died knowing that in winter, the enemy would come, bringing death and fire in the name of their god. This constant threat formed a militarized society where every man was a warrior and every prince, first and foremost, a commander. The response to this constant threat was a unique system of power that had developed under Gediminas. His sons, Algirdas and Kęstutis, divided their spheres of influence. Kęstutis, the father of the famous Vytautas, took upon himself the defense of the western borders. He became a legendary warrior, the living shield of Lithuania, who spent his entire life in battles with the Crusaders. He was the embodiment of old pagan virtues, courage, loyalty, and honor. Algirdas, on the other hand, was engaged in Eastern policy, expanding his domains at the expense of Russian lands. This diarchy of 2 brothers was the guarantee of the state's stability and power. It was this world that Jogaila inherited in the year 1377, a world torn by internal and external contradictions. He received supreme power, but his numerous brothers and uncles were not going to simply accept this. He inherited a sacred duty to continue the war with the Crusaders, but he already understood that pagan Lithuania could not stand alone in this war. He was a ruler at a crossroads. He had to choose a path, to continue the old policy that was leading to a dead end, or to seek new, unthinkable alliances. And he would begin to make this choice very soon by concluding a secret treaty with the sworn enemies of his people. A young wolf that has taken the leader's place must immediately show its strength, or the pack will tear it to pieces. As soon as he ascended the Grand Ducal throne, Jogaila found himself surrounded by enemies. His older brothers passed over in the will, rebelled. His powerful uncle Kęstutis, his father's loyal ally, looked at him with suspicion. And the Teutonic Knights, the eternal enemies, saw their chance in the family strife. In this seething cauldron of intrigue, betrayal, and ambition, the young prince had to make his first move. And that move was shocking. In secret from everyone, he extended his hand not to friends but to enemies. In a dark forest, by a border post, a secret treaty was signed that was to forever change the balance of power in the region. But the price of this treaty was terrible, the betrayal of his own blood. The first years of Jogaila's reign were a time of chaos. Algirdas's will had exploded the fragile balance in the Gediminid family. The first to oppose the new Grand Duke was his older half-brother, Andrei of Polotsk. He considered himself the legitimate heir and, not receiving Vilnius, fled to Pskov and from there to Moscow, seeking an alliance with Dmitry Donskoy against his own brother. Soon another brother, Dmitry of Bryansk, joined him. From the east loomed the threat of a major war, but Jogaila's main problem was not in the east, but in the west, in the very heart of Lithuania. It was his relationship with his powerful uncle, Duke Kęstutis of Trakai. While Algirdas was alive, their alliance was unshakable. Kęstutis recognized his brother's supreme authority and faithfully served the common cause. But he was not prepared to submit so unconditionally to his young and inexperienced nephew, especially since behind Jogaila stood his mother, the cunning and power-hungry Uliana of Tver, and his orthodox advisors whom the old pagan Kęstutis despised. Kęstutis initially recognized Jogaila as Grand Duke, but tensions between their courts grew. Every wrong step, every rumor bred suspicion. The Teutonic order, masters of intrigue and provocation, skillfully added fuel to the fire. The Crusaders saw their golden opportunity in this discord to weaken Lithuania from within. Jogaila found himself in a desperate situation. He was caught between rebellious brothers who relied on Moscow and an increasingly hostile uncle who was an idol for all of Lithuania's pagan knighthood. In this situation, he made a decision that would define his entire subsequent reputation as an unprincipled and treacherous politician. He decided to conclude a separate peace with the Teutonic order to free his hands for the fight against internal enemies. But this peace had to be directed against someone, and that someone was his uncle Kęstutis. On May 31st, 1380, secret negotiations took place in the castle of Dovydiškės. Jogaila's representatives met with the Komtur of Ostrów, Gunther von Hohenstein, and other high-ranking Teutonic officials. A secret treaty was signed. Its terms were cynical and simple. Jogaila and the order concluded a truce. The order pledged not to attack Jogaila's lands. However, this truce did not extend to Kęstutis's lands. In fact, Jogaila was giving the Crusaders carte blanche to ravage the western part of the duchy, which his uncle was defending. He was betraying the man who had been Lithuania's shield his entire life in exchange for his own security. The meaning of this treaty is still debated by historians. Was it an act of desperation, the only way for the young prince to hold on to power? Or was it a cold, calculated plan to eliminate a powerful uncle who stood in the way of his absolute rule? Did Kęstutis know about this treaty? Some Lithuanian chronicles claim that he knew and even gave his consent, seeing it as a clever way to deceive the Crusaders. But most historians agree that it was a direct betrayal. The consequences were not long in coming. While Jogaila was busy suppressing the rebellion of his brothers in the east, the Crusaders fell upon Kęstutis's domains. At this moment, Jogaila was far away on the Vosges River, where he was supposed to join the forces of the Tatar Khan Mamai for a joint campaign against Moscow. But as is well known, he never arrived at the Kulikovo field. Whether he was late by accident or deliberately bided his time, not wanting to get involved in a risky battle, is another mystery of his biography. When he returned to Lithuania, the deception was revealed. Kęstutis learned of the secret treaty. His patience ran out. The old warrior, who was already in his late 70s, acted with the determination and fury of a young wolf. The old lion, thought to be no longer dangerous, struck back. His nephew's betrayal awakened Kęstutis's former fury. He did not wait for his enemies to come for him. Gathering his loyal warriors, he made a swift dash that was meant to change everything in an instant. Vilnius, the capital of the Grand Duchy, fell into his hands. Jogaila was overthrown, but this was only the first act of a bloody drama. Ahead were new intrigues, false oaths, and the grim walls of Krewo Castle, which would soon witness a terrible crime. The struggle for power was entering its darkest and most brutal phase. At the end of 1381, Kęstutis, upon learning the true content of the Treaty of Dovydiškės, realized that his nephew had crossed a line. He could no longer trust him. Gathering his retinue from Trakai and Samogitia, he made a lightning-fast march on Vilnius. Jogaila, caught by surprise, could not organize resistance and was captured. Kęstutis proclaimed himself Grand Duke of Lithuania. It seemed that justice had triumphed. The old, universally respected warrior had taken the throne that many believed was his by right. He treated his nephew with surprising leniency. He neither executed him nor threw him into a dungeon. Instead, he returned to him his paternal lands of Krewo and Vitebsk and took an oath of loyalty from him. This was a manifestation of old knightly notions of honor. But Kęstutis had underestimated the cunning of his nephew and his mother Uliana. For Jogaila, oaths were just words and humiliation demanded revenge. While Kęstutis was busy with the war against the Crusaders, who had now naturally become his enemies, and suppressing the rebellion of one of Jogaila's supporters, Jogaila began to gather forces for a comeback. He used all available means. He made an alliance with his brother Skirgaila, promising him Polotsk. He entered into secret negotiations with the Livonian Order, which was a branch of the Teutonic Order and often acted independently. He won over many Orthodox boyars who were dissatisfied with the rule of the stern pagan Kęstutis. In the summer of 1382, while Kęstutis and his son Vytautas were on a campaign, Jogaila struck. He suddenly seized Vilnius and then Trakai, his uncle's ancestral castle. Kęstutis and Vytautas, learning of the rebellion, were forced to return urgently. The two Lithuanian armies met near Trakai. Their forces were roughly equal, and no one dared to start a battle that threatened to turn into a fratricidal massacre. And then Jogaila resorted to his favorite tactic, cunning. He sent envoys to his uncle with an offer of negotiations. He swore by all the gods that he guaranteed him and Vytautas complete safety. He claimed he did not want bloodshed and desired only peace. The old Kęstutis, perhaps tired of the endless war or perhaps believing to the end in the sanctity of an oath, made a fatal mistake. He believed. Leaving his army, he, along with his son Vytautas and his closest associates, arrived at Jogaila's camp. As soon as they entered the tent, they were seized. It was a trap. They were immediately sent in chains under guard to Krewo Castle, one of the fortresses belonging to Jogaila. The subsequent events are shrouded in a dark mystery and contradictory testimonies. 5 days after being captured, it was announced that the old Duke Kęstutis had died. The official version, spread by Jogaila, was that he had fallen into despair and hanged himself. But no one believed this version. The Teutonic chronicles and many later sources unanimously state that he was murdered on Jogaila's orders. The most common version is that he was strangled by Jogaila's servants. The elderly warrior, the hero of Lithuania, who had fought against its enemies his entire life, was vilely murdered in a dungeon by the hand of his nephew. Vytautas's fate also hung in the balance. He understood that the same fate awaited him, but his wife Anna saved him. During one of her visits with her husband, she persuaded him to exchange clothes. Vytautas, disguised in his maid's dress, managed to leave the castle unnoticed under the cover of night. It was a daring and humiliating escape, but it saved his life. He fled to where all enemies of the Grand Dukes of Lithuania fled, to Prussia, to the Teutonic Knights. He went to the sworn enemies of his father and his people to ask for their help in the fight against his father's murderer. The blood feud between the two cousins, Jogaila and Vytautas, was just beginning, and this feud would for many years become the main axis of the entire domestic policy of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Jogaila, at the cost of betrayal and murder, had achieved absolute power. But this victory was bought at too high a price. It left an indelible stain on his reputation and created an enemy who would prove to be far more dangerous and cunning than his old uncle. In Krakow, the capital of the glorious Kingdom of Poland, confusion and anxiety reigned. The throne was vacant after the death of the great King Louis of Hungary. All that remained was his young daughter Jadwiga, a child of 11 whom the barons had proclaimed not queen but king to emphasize her full sovereign power. But the kingdom, wedged between the Holy Roman Empire and the pagan world, needed not just a monarch in a skirt. It needed a husband for Jadwiga, a warrior and a ruler capable of defending the borders and strengthening the state. And so, from the deep forests of the north, from where pagan fires still burned, came an embassy with a proposal that seemed both salvific and monstrous. The last pagan ruler of Europe was asking for the hand of the young Christian queen. This dynastic marriage could change the map of Europe, but the price was high. The union of two worlds that for centuries had viewed each other with hatred and suspicion. While Jogaila was asserting his power in Lithuania, spilling the blood of relatives, his own drama was unfolding in neighboring Poland. In the year 1382, King Louis the Great of Poland and Hungary, of the Angevin dynasty, died. He left no male heirs, and this immediately created a dynastic crisis. The Polish magnates, the so-called szlachta, did not wish to continue the personal union with Hungary. They demanded that one of Louis's daughters rule specifically in Poland. The choice fell on the younger, Jadwiga. In 1384, she arrived in Krakow and was crowned. But the young queen, who was only 11 at the time, urgently needed a husband. She was originally betrothed to her contemporary, Duke William of Habsburg of Austria. This marriage was a settled matter. The young people, according to rumors, even had a childish affection for each other. But this union did not suit the Polish nobility at all, especially the magnates of Lesser Poland. They were not so much displeased with William himself as with the powerful Habsburg dynasty behind him. They feared that a marriage with a Habsburg would turn Poland into a golden cage, making it an eastern outpost of the Holy Roman Empire and embroiling it in foreign German intrigues. They sought another candidate who would meet Poland's geopolitical interests, but this plan of the Lesser Poland magnates met with fierce resistance. The nobility of Greater Poland, the historical core of the state, saw this union as a threat to their interests and put forward their own candidate, Duke Siemowit IV of Masovia, a descendant of the Piasts. Siemowit even tried to seize Krakow by force and kidnap the young Jadwiga. Civil war was brewing in Poland. Only thanks to the decisive actions of the Krakow aristocracy, who locked the gates of Wawel and put a garrison on the walls, was the coup attempt foiled. Thus, the proposal made by Jogaila was not only a bold geopolitical move, but also a desperate gamble by one of the Polish factions in the brutal internal struggle for power. And then, a few far-sighted Lesser Poland lords, such as Spytek of Melstin and Jan of Tenchin, came up with a brilliant and at the same time radical idea. What if this ally were the enemy itself, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania? What if the husband for the young Jadwiga were Grand Duke Jogaila? For them, he was the perfect useful barbarian, strong enough to become a battering ram against the order, but at the same time wild enough and inexperienced in European politics to be manageable, to have their own terms imposed on him. At first glance, this idea seemed absurd, to offer the hand of a pious Catholic queen to a pagan, a fratricide, the ruler of a wild and hostile people? It was unheard of. But from the point of view of realpolitik, the benefits were enormous. Firstly, this union would create a most powerful state in Eastern Europe, capable of resisting the Teutonic order. A common threat was to unite the two old enemies. Secondly, Jogaila, upon marrying, would have to accept Catholicism himself and Christianize all of Lithuania. This meant the end of the last bastion of paganism in Europe. For Poland, this was a great civilizing mission, which brought it glory and the approval of the Papal Sees. Moreover, the Christianization of Lithuania would pull the rug out from under the Teutonic order, which would lose its ideological justification for waging war. Thirdly, Jogaila had to join his vast domains, including the lands in Rus, to the Polish crown. This would resolve the dispute over Galicia in Poland's favor and open the way for its expansion to the east. Fourthly, Jogaila promised to pay William of Habsburg a huge compensation of 200,000 florins for the broken engagement. For Jogaila, this proposal was also a salvation. His position in Lithuania was precarious. His cousin Vytautas, having made an alliance with the Crusaders, was waging a devastating war against him. He had already besieged Vilnius twice and had even converted to Catholicism, ceding Samogitia to the order. Jogaila understood that he could not cope alone. An alliance with Poland gave him a powerful ally, legitimized his power, and allowed him to gain access to European military and cultural technologies. There was, to be sure, another option, an alliance with Moscow, marriage to the daughter of Dmitry Donskoy, and the adoption of orthodoxy. Such negotiations were also underway, but that path meant submission to Moscow and continued war with the Catholic world. The Polish option opened a window to Europe. In January 1385, a Lithuanian embassy led by Jogaila's brother Skirgaila arrived in Krakow and officially made the proposal. Long and painful negotiations began. Jadwiga was in despair. She did not want to marry a 40-year-old. Rumored to be wild and ugly barbarian, legend has it that she even tried to chop through the gates of Wawel Castle with an axe to escape to her beloved William, who had secretly come to Krakow. But the old magnate Demeter of Goraj persuaded her to make her personal sacrifice for the good of the kingdom. On August 14th, 1385, in Krewo Castle, the same one where Kęstutis was murdered, the famous Union of Krewo was signed. Jogaila solemnly swore to fulfill all the conditions of the Polish side. The fate of two nations was decided. The pagan duke was preparing to become a Christian king. The journey from the wild forests of the north to the shining capital of Krakow was long. For Jogaila, it was not just a geographical route, but a journey to another world. He had to change not only his faith and name, but his entire way of life. The pagan chieftain, accustomed to the simplicity of campaign life, had to become a European monarch, to enter the world of courtly culture, complex court rituals, and Catholic theology. His baptism and coronation were to become a symbol of the birth of a new great power. But behind the magnificent ceremony lay unresolved problems, a jilted fiancé ready for revenge, powerful enemies on the borders, and a young wife who looked at her barbarian husband with fear and disgust. In early 1386, Jogaila, at the head of a magnificent retinue consisting of his brothers, princes, and boyars, arrived in Poland. His path lay through Lublin to Krakow. For the Polish nobility, gathered to greet their future king, it was an unprecedented sight. They saw not savages in animal skins, but powerful nobles dressed in expensive silks and furs, albeit in an Eastern fashion. Jogaila himself, despite rumors of his ugliness, turned out to be a tall, stately man with a penetrating gaze. He carried himself with dignity but was cautious and taciturn. On February 15th, 1386, a historic event took place in Wawel Cathedral in Krakow. The Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jogaila, was baptized according to the Catholic rite. One of the Polish nobles became his godfather. He was given a new Christian name, Władysław, in honor of the penultimate king of the Piast dynasty, Władysław the Elbow High, who had united Poland. Together with him were baptized his brothers. Skirgaila received the name Casimir, Korybut, Dmitry, and Świetlgaila, Bolesław. This act symbolized the entry of the Lithuanian ruling elite into the family of Catholic nations of Europe. 3 days later, on February 18th, the wedding of the 40-year-old Władysław Jagiełło and the 13-year-old Jadwiga took place. The ceremony was magnificent, but according to contemporaries, the young queen was pale and sad. She was fulfilling her duty to the state, but her heart was broken. A legend, recorded by the chronicler Jan Długosz, says that Jogaila, wishing to dispel his young wife's fears, took a long bath before their wedding night to prove that he was not covered in fur like a wild beast and showed her his quite human physique. In any case, their marriage, which began as a cold political transaction, over time grew into a relationship based on mutual respect. Jadwiga, being a highly educated and deeply religious woman, had an immense influence on her husband, softening his harsh nature and guiding him on the path of Christian piety. On March 4th, 1386, Władysław Jagiełło was solemnly crowned King of Poland. He was now King of Poland and Supreme Duke of Lithuania. The two states were linked by a personal union, but this was only the beginning of a path full of difficulties. The first problem was Jadwiga's jilted fiancé, William of Habsburg. He was not going to give up so easily. He and his supporters in Poland spread rumors that his marriage with Jadwiga had already been consummated, and therefore her new marriage with Jogaila was uncanonical. They appealed to the Pope. Jogaila had to spend enormous sums of money and exert considerable diplomatic efforts to settle this scandal and prove the legitimacy of his marriage and his title. The second and main problem was Lithuania itself. Jogaila, having become King of Poland, could not be constantly in his hereditary lands. He left his brother Skirgaila as his viceroy in Vilnius, a cruel and unpopular man. This immediately caused discontent among the Lithuanian nobility, who did not want to become an appendage of Poland, and most importantly, on the borders still stood Vytautas, who now had a new trump card. He declared himself the defender of Lithuania's independence from Polish absorption. The Teutonic Order in turn refused to recognize Jogaila's baptism. The knights claimed that this baptism was a fiction, a political trick, and that the Lithuanians remained pagans at heart. They continued their raids now under the pretext of defending the true faith from false Christians. In the spring of 1387, Jogaila, together with Jadwiga, traveled to Lithuania to personally conduct its official Christianization. It was a grand missionary expedition. A Catholic bishopric was founded in Vilnius. Throughout Aukštaitija, sacred groves were cut down, pagan fires were extinguished, and idols of Perkunas and other gods were toppled. Peasants were herded to rivers and baptized entire villages at a time, giving all men of one parish the name Peter and of another Paul. The newly converted were given white woolen shirts, which, according to contemporaries, was a far greater incentive for them than theological disputes. The Lithuanian boyars who accepted Catholicism received enormous privileges, including the right to inherit land, which they did not have before. This created a new, Catholic and pro-Polish-minded layer of aristocracy. But this was only the tip of the iceberg. In the forests of Samogitia in the west, paganism continued to live, and the Orthodox population of the Rusian lands of the GDL looked with suspicion on the strengthening of Catholic influence. Jogaila, by becoming King of Poland, had not solved his old problems but had only acquired new ones. He faced a long and exhausting struggle to turn the fictitious union, sealed on parchment, into a real and lasting one. And the main obstacle on this path remained his indomitable cousin. The shadow of the past would not let the new king go. Exiled but not broken, Vytautas, like a phoenix, rose again and again from the ashes. Armed with the swords of the Teutonic knights, he returned to Lithuania not as a supplicant but as a conqueror. For him, this was not just a struggle for power. It was a sacred revenge for his murdered father and for his stolen heritage. For Jogaila, this was the most terrible ordeal. He had to wage a war on two fronts, against an external enemy who used his cousin as a battering ram, and against internal separatism of which Vytautas had become the banner. The blood feud between the two Gediminids threatened to tear the young, not yet strengthened Polish-Lithuanian state to pieces. After Jogaila's coronation and the official Christianization of Lithuania, Vytautas found himself in a difficult position. The Teutonic Order, his main ally, had for a time lost its pretext for war. But Vytautas was too valuable an instrument to be discarded so easily. The Crusaders continued to support him, hoping with his help either to dismember Lithuania or to place their puppet on the throne in Vilnius. Vytautas himself proved to be a brilliant politician and diplomat, in no way inferior and in many ways superior to Jogaila. He began to position himself as the defender of Lithuanian independence. He sent letters to European monarchs arguing that Jogaila had illegally seized power and wanted to subordinate free Lithuania to the Poles. He played on the feelings of the Lithuanian boyars, who feared losing their influence. In 1389, Vytautas, with the support of the order, began a new major war against Jogaila. This was a real civil war, devastating the Lithuanian lands. The Crusaders, together with Vytautas's detachments, invaded the duchy and laid siege to Vilnius. Their army included the best knights of Europe, including the future King Henry IV of England, then Earl of Derby. The siege was fierce. The Crusaders used the latest siege artillery. One of Vilnius's castles, the Crooked Castle, was taken by storm and burned. Its defenders, including Jogaila's brother Karigaila, were killed. But the upper castle, where the Polish-Lithuanian garrison was held out. Jogaila was in a desperate situation. He could not throw all of Poland's forces to help Lithuania, as many Polish lords considered it an internal Lithuanian affair. The war was draining the resources of both states and only played into the hands of the Teutonic Order, which received more and more concessions from Vytautas in exchange for help. Vytautas, in turn, also understood that his alliance with the Crusaders was a deal with the devil. He saw that the knights were acting in Lithuanian castles as if they were their own, and he understood that they would never allow him to become a truly independent ruler. Both cousins, being pragmatists to the core, realized that their deadly enmity was leading them both into an abyss. They had to negotiate. Jogaila made the first move. He sent a secret envoy to Vytautas, the Polish knight Henry of Masovia, Bishop of Płock. Henry managed to convince Vytautas that Jogaila was ready to make serious concessions and was offering him not just peace, but real power in Lithuania. Vytautas decided to take a risky step. He staged an attack on 2 Teutonic castles that he himself had given them, burned them, and with his loyal detachments defected to Jogaila's side. For the Crusaders, this was a terrible blow and an unheard-of betrayal. They had lost both their main ally and all the lands he had promised them. In the summer of 1392, a historic meeting between Jogaila and Vytautas took place at the estate of Ostrów, near Lida. After years of enmity, the cousins finally made peace. The terms of the Ostrów agreement were a result of a brilliant compromise. Jogaila retained the supreme title Grand Duke of Lithuania, or as he was now called, Supreme Duke. But all real lifelong power in the Grand Duchy was transferred to Vytautas, who became the Grand Duke. He recognized himself as Jogaila's vassal, but in practice, he was almost completely independent. This treaty became the foundation upon which Polish-Lithuanian relations were built for the next 40 years. It put an end to the destructive civil war. It united the forces of the two states against their common enemy, the Teutonic Order, and it created a unique political tandem. Jogaila, as the cautious and prudent king of Poland, and Vytautas, as the energetic, ambitious, and warlike ruler of Lithuania, could now act in concert. Their personal relations remained complex forever. They never fully trusted each other. A rivalry remained between them. Vytautas throughout his life strove for a royal crown and complete independence, while Jogaila jealously guarded his supreme rights. But they both understood that without each other they could not survive. The shadow of the murdered Kęstutis never disappeared, but over it lay the seal of state interest. Former mortal enemies had become forced allies, and this alliance was soon to be tested in the fire of the greatest battle of that era. The storm that had been gathering over Eastern Europe for a century was ready to break. The Teutonic order, intoxicated by its power and impunity, had reached the peak of its might. The Polish-Lithuanian Union, sealed by the reconciliation of Jogaila and Vytautas, had gained strength and was thirsty for revenge. The pretext for the clash of two worlds was a small wild land on the shore of the Baltic Sea, Samogitia. It was here, in the last bastion of Lithuanian paganism, that the spark was lit that would kindle the flame of the Great War. Two gigantic armies, the likes of which this part of the world had never seen, began their slow, inexorable march towards each other, towards a field that would go down in history under the name of Grunwald. After the Ostrów agreement, the main common goal of Jogaila and Vytautas became the solution of the Teutonic problem. But the path to open conflict was long and winding. Vytautas, having established himself in Lithuania, first tried to expand his domains to the east. He made several major campaigns into Russian lands, subjugating Smolensk and interfering in Moscow's affairs. He even made an alliance with the Tatar Khan Toktamish and dreamed of placing him on the throne of the Golden Horde, so that then, with his help, he could unite all of Eastern Europe under his rule. But these grandiose plans collapsed in 1399 at the Battle of the Vorskla River, where the combined Lithuanian-Rusian Tatar army was utterly defeated by the horde's Emir Edigu. Vytautas barely escaped with his life. This defeat sobered him. He realized that his main interest lay not in the east but in the west. He needed to reclaim Samogitia, his patrimony, which he had twice ceded to the Crusaders. This land was strategically important for the order as it connected its Prussian and Livonian possessions. But the Samogitians, freedom-loving and stubborn pagans, had never submitted to German rule. They constantly rebelled. Jogaila and Vytautas began to play a double game. Officially, they maintained peace with the order. Vytautas even helped the Crusaders suppress Samogitian revolts. But secretly they supported the rebels, sending them weapons, money, and men. They were waiting for the right moment. That moment came in 1409. A new, most powerful rebellion broke out in Samogitia. This time, Vytautas openly supported it. The new Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, the aggressive and self-confident Ulrich von Jungingen, demanded that Jogaila, as Vytautas's supreme suzerain, not interfere. Jogaila replied with the famous phrase that he could not abandon his Samogitian brothers and that a blow against Lithuania he would consider a blow against Poland. This was tantamount to a declaration of war. On August 6th, 1409, the Grand Master sent a formal declaration of war to Krakow. The Great War had begun. Both sides began feverish preparations. The Teutonic Order hired thousands of mercenary knights from all over Europe. Their army was considered invincible, a model of military organization and discipline. Jogaila and Vytautas in turn announced a general mobilization. For the first time, the combined forces of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania were preparing to march together. The Allies' preparations were exemplary. Jogaila, contrary to his reputation as an indecisive politician, proved to be a brilliant organizer and strategist. In the forest near Kozienice, materials were prepared for the construction of a huge pontoon bridge, which was to ensure a quick crossing of the Vistula. Huge depots of food and fodder were created in Płock. Vytautas gathered under his banners not only Lithuanian and Samogitian warriors, but also regiments from all the Rusian lands that were part of the GDL, Smolensk, Kiev, Polotsk. He even brought with him a detachment of Tatar cavalry under the command of his friend, Khan Jalal al-Din, son of Toktamish. In addition, the Allied army included detachments of Czech mercenaries, among them the future great Hussite commander Jadwiga. The winter campaign of 1409 did not bring a decisive success to either side. A temporary truce was concluded until the summer of the following year. Both sides used this respite to build up their forces and engage in diplomatic struggle. The Crusaders tried to blacken Jogaila's name in the eyes of Europe, calling him an ally of pagans and Tatars. Jogaila in turn sent letters to European monarchs, proving the aggressive and predatory nature of the order's policy. In the summer of 1410, the war resumed. The Allies' plan was daring and unexpected. Instead of marching north to the coast, they decided to unite their armies in central Poland and strike a direct blow at the heart of the order, at its capital, Marienburg. At the end of June, the Polish army crossed the Vistula on the pre-built pontoon bridge near Czerwinsk and joined Vytautas's troops, which had come from the east. The huge multilingual army marched north into the territory of Prussia. Ulrich von Jungingen, learning of this, was forced to hastily gather all his forces to block their path. A decisive clash was becoming inevitable. July 15th, 1410. The sun rose over the hilly plain between the villages of Grunwald, Tannenberg, and Ludwigsdorf. The morning mist slowly dispersed, revealing an unprecedented sight. At one end of the field, under black crosses on white cloaks, stood the neat ranks of the Teutonic knights, the flower of European chivalry, clad in gleaming armor. At the other end, under a colorful sea of banners with Polish eagles, the Lithuanian Pahonia and Rusian saints, roared the huge, diverse Allied army. The air was still in tense anticipation. Two heralds from the Grand Master brought Jogaila and Vytautas two naked swords, a defiant challenge to battle. The greatest battle of the European Middle Ages was about to begin. The Battle of Grunwald, or as the Lithuanians call it, the Battle of Algirdas, was the culmination of a century-long confrontation. The forces involved were enormous. According to modern estimates, the Allied army numbered about 39,000 men, 27,000 in the Polish-Lithuanian cavalry and infantry, and 11,000 in Vytautas's troops. The army of the Teutonic Order was smaller, about 27,000 men, but it was better armed, more disciplined, and consisted mainly of heavy knightly cavalry. King Jogaila, as the supreme commander, did not take direct part in the battle. Already an elderly man, he positioned himself on a hill from which he had a view of the entire battlefield, and from there, surrounded by a small detachment of bodyguards and advisors, he directed the general course of the battle. This was a new, advanced tactic, not typical of medieval monarchs who usually charged into the thick of the fray. Jogaila acted like a modern strategic commander. The direct command of the troops was exercised by the Crown Marshal Zbigniew of Brzezy for the Poles, and by Grand Duke Vytautas for the Lithuanian-Rusian forces. The battle began around noon, after several hours of tense standoff. As the knights sweltered in their armor, Ulrich von Jungingen gave the order to attack. Vytautas's troops on the Allied right flank were the first to engage. The light Tatar cavalry and Lithuanian horsemen crashed into the Teutonic left wing. A fierce battle ensued. After about an hour of fighting, an event occurred that still causes debate among historians. The Lithuanian-Rusian troops, unable to withstand the onslaught of the iron knightly cavalry, wavered and began to retreat. The retreat quickly turned into a panicked flight. The Crusaders, believing victory was in their hands, gave chase, breaking their battle formation. Was it a real flight, or was it a cunning tactical maneuver? A so-called feigned retreat, which the Tatars and Lithuanians had used more than once in battles with the Crusaders? Most modern historians lean towards the second version. The purpose of this maneuver was to lure part of the knights into a trap, separate them from the main forces, and break the integrity of their battle line. However, the three Smolensk regiments standing in the center of the Lithuanian army did not retreat. They remained in place and took the full brunt of the attack. Surrounded on all sides, they fought with desperate courage, suffering huge losses but holding back the enemy and preventing them from striking the Polish flank. This heroic episode, described by Jadwiga, largely saved the situation on this section of the front. Meanwhile, the main forces, the so-called Great Banners of the Order under the command of the Grand Marshal Friedrich von Wallenrode, crashed into the Polish right flank and center. A terrible slaughter began. At one point in the battle, the standard-bearer of the Krakow land dropped the main banner of the kingdom, the great standard with the white eagle. For a medieval army, this was a sign of defeat. The Crusaders raised a victory cry and were already preparing to celebrate. But the Polish knights, in a desperate impulse, charged forward, recaptured their banner, and attacked the enemy with renewed fury. This was the turning point of the battle. Ulrich von Jungingen, seeing that the Polish ranks were not broken and that his best forces were bogged down in the fight, decided to commit his last reserve, 16 banners that he had kept with him. He personally led them and maneuvered around the Polish right flank to strike at the center and reach King Jogaila's position. This was the most dangerous moment for the Allies. Jogaila, seeing the avalanche of knights rushing towards him, refused to leave his observation post. One Teutonic knight broke through to the king himself, but was knocked from his horse and killed by the royal secretary, Zbigniew Olesnicki. At this same critical moment, two decisive events occurred. Firstly, Jogaila committed his last reserves, which struck the flank of the Grand Master's attacking column. And secondly, Vytautas's troops suddenly returned to the battlefield. Having lured and defeated their pursuers, the Lithuanian cavalry turned and struck the rear of the Crusaders' main forces. The Teutonic army found itself in a cauldron. A total annihilation began. Surrounded, demoralized, the knights fought to the last but were doomed. In this melee, the Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen himself perished. With him fell the entire flower of Teutonic chivalry, the Grand Marshal, the Grand Komtur, and hundreds of order brothers. By evening, it was all over. The field green that morning had turned into a bloody mess, strewn with tens of thousands of bodies of men and horses. An unimaginable din hung over the field, the groans of thousands of wounded whom no one was going to save. At night, as the chronicles tell, it rained, washing away the blood but unable to drown out the cries of the dying. The great army of the Teutonic Order had ceased to exist. It was one of the most complete and decisive victories in the history of medieval Europe. Jogaila and Vytautas had achieved a triumph that would forever change the history of Eastern Europe. The greatest victory had been won. The enemy that had terrorized its neighbors for a century and a half was defeated and decapitated. It seemed that now only one final blow was needed to wipe the predatory Crusader state from the map of Europe forever. The way to Marienburg, the capital of the Order, to its impregnable dragon's lair was open. But after the resounding triumph of Grunwald, a strange, inexplicable pause followed. The victors hesitated, and this delay allowed the wounded beast to lick its wounds and take refuge in its stronghold. Why did the great victory not end in the total annihilation of the enemy? Was it a mistake, fatigue, or the cold calculation of a cunning king who did not want too much strengthening for either Poland or Lithuania? After the battle, the Allied army remained on the field for 3 days. The soldiers looted the huge Teutonic baggage train, buried the dead, and celebrated the victory. Jogaila ordered the body of the Grand Master and other noble knights to be buried with honor. This delay proved fatal. While the victors were resting, dramatic events were unfolding in the capital of the Order, Marienburg, modern Malbork. A handful of surviving knights brought the news of the catastrophe. Panic reigned in the city. It seemed all was lost, but the commander of the castle was a man of iron will, Komtur Heinrich von Plauen of Schwetz. He had not participated in the battle and had preserved his detachment. He immediately took power into his own hands, organized the defense, ordered the town to be burned so it would not fall to the enemy, and gathered all the surrounding garrisons into the castle. He was preparing for a siege. Only 3 days after the battle did the Allied army finally march on Marienburg. But time had been lost. When Jogaila and Vytautas approached the walls of the greatest brick fortress in Europe, they saw that it was ready for defense. A long and grueling siege began. Marienburg Castle was a marvel of fortification engineering. It was a system of 3 castles surrounded by powerful walls and moats with huge stocks of food and weapons. To take it by storm was practically impossible. The Allies began a bombardment with their bombards, but their cannonballs could not do serious harm to the thick walls. The siege lasted for 2 months from July to September. Problems began in the Allies' camp. The army, consisting of levies, was not prepared for a long siege. Diseases, especially dysentery, broke out. There was a shortage of food. The mercenaries demanded pay. The Polish and Lithuanian feudal lords wanted to return home for the harvest. Vytautas, always pursuing his own goals, was the first to withdraw his troops, stating that his duty was done. Soon others followed his example. At the end of September, Jogaila was forced to lift the siege and retreat. The main prize had slipped from his hands. The war continued for several more months, but no longer had the same scale. Heinrich von Plauen, elected the new Grand Master, managed to gather new forces and even won several local victories. In February 1411, a peace treaty known as the First Peace of Thorn was signed in the city of Torun. Its terms were surprisingly lenient and did not at all correspond to the scale of the Grunwald victory. The order renounced Samogitia, but only for the lifetimes of Jogaila and Vytautas. It was to pay a huge indemnity for the ransom of captured knights, and that was all. The order retained almost all its lands, including Pomerania with Danzig. Why did Jogaila agree to such a peace? Historians still debate this. Perhaps he was exhausted by the war and had no strength to continue it. Perhaps he was pressured by other European monarchs, such as Emperor Sigismund of Luxembourg, who did not want the complete destruction of the order, seeing it as a counterweight to the growing power of the Polish-Lithuanian state. Or perhaps it was another cunning move by Jogaila himself. He did not want the complete defeat of the order, as the common Teutonic threat was the main cement holding together his fragile union with Lithuania and the willful Vytautas. If the order disappeared, Vytautas might again demand full independence. Moreover, the complete annexation of Prussia to Poland would make it too strong, upsetting the balance within the Union. In any case, the Battle of Grunwald and the First Peace of Thorn became a turning point. The military power of the Teutonic Order was broken forever. It would never again pose a mortal threat to its neighbors. The huge indemnity undermined its economy. Its slow but steady decline began, which would end half a century later with its vassal oath to the Polish king. And the Polish-Lithuanian Union, on the contrary, established itself as the dominant power in Eastern and Central Europe. Jogaila, who had begun his journey as a pagan prince on the brink of ruin, now stood at the head of one of the largest powers on the continent. The triumph at Grunwald was the pinnacle of Jogaila's reign, but not its end. He was to live for another 24 years, filled with tireless labors, diplomatic intrigues, and family dramas. He outlived his brilliant and restless cousin Vytautas, who died in 1430. Never having received the royal crown that Jogaila, under pressure from Polish lords, never allowed him to accept. He waged several more wars with the Teutonic Order, gradually winning back disputed lands. He fought against the opposition within Poland, where the nobility demanded ever greater rights and privileges. But the main concern of his old age was the problem of succession. His marriage to Jadwiga was childless. His second wife, Anna of Chile, bore him only a daughter. His third, Elizabeth Granowska, was already old. The Polish lords looked to the future with anxiety, fearing a new interregnum after the old king's death. And only his fourth wife, the young Lithuanian Princess Sophia of Halshani, when Jogaila was already over 70, gave him the long-awaited sons, Władysław and Casimir. To secure the throne for them, Jogaila had to make huge concessions to the nobility, issuing a series of privileges that laid the foundations for the future noble democracy. And, at the same time, weakened royal power. He died on June 2, 1434, at the age of over 80, having been on the Polish throne for 48 years. He was buried in Wawel Cathedral in Krakow, next to his first wife, Queen Jadwiga. Jogaila's legacy is immense and multifaceted, and his historical assessment still causes disputes and depends on the historian's national affiliation. For the Poles, he is one of the greatest monarchs in history, the founder of the powerful Jagiellonian dynasty which ruled in Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, and Bohemia, creating a huge Jagiellonian empire. He is the victor of Grunwald who crushed a centuries-old enemy. He is the architect of the Polish-Lithuanian Union, which for several centuries defined the geopolitical map of Eastern Europe and created a unique multinational state, the Commonwealth. His personal flaws, the cunning and cruelty shown in his youth, recede into the background before his state achievements. For Lithuanians, his figure is much more controversial. On the one hand, he is the one who brought Catholicism and European culture to Lithuania, who, in alliance with Vytautas, saved the country from Teutonic destruction. But on the other hand, he is the one who concluded the union that, according to many Lithuanian historians, led to the gradual Polonization of the Lithuanian nobility and the loss of cultural identity. He is the one who put Poland's interests above those of his homeland. In the Lithuanian national pantheon, the number one hero is not the cunning Jogaila, but the indomitable Vytautas, who fought for the independence and greatness of Lithuania. For Ukrainians and Belarusians, whose lands constituted the greater part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, he is the ruler under whom their ancestors were drawn into the orbit of Central European politics. His reign was a time when West Ruthenian Orthodox culture continued to develop in conditions of relative tolerance, but at the same time, the gradual penetration of Catholicism and Polish influence began. Ultimately, Jogaila was a man of his time. A transitional era, he combined the features of a medieval ruler, cruelty, cunning, deep personal religiosity, with the qualities of a New Age politician, pragmatism, flexibility, a capacity for compromise and strategic thinking. He was neither a hero in shining armor nor a demonic villain. He was a master of political survival who, in incredibly difficult conditions, managed not only to preserve his power and his country, but also to lay the foundation for a new great power. He was the bridge by which his people, the Lithuanians, crossed from the darkness of the pagan past into the complex and contradictory world of Christian Europe. And like any bridge, he connected two banks but forever remained between them, belonging equally to both worlds. The story of Jogaila is the story of how the last pagan prince of Europe, acting on the verge of betrayal and genius, managed to guide his people and his new kingdom through the storms of history and forever inscribe the name of his dynasty on the map of Europe.